Yeah. Hi, hello everyone. Please be seated. So, welcome all to FLAD. It's a pleasure to have you here. My name is Rita Faden. I'm FLAD's president. Most of you, I hope, already know what FLAD is, but for those of you who don't know what FLAD is, we are a private Portuguese foundation whose mission is to promote the development of Portugal through the bilateral cooperation with the United States. We work in 4 main areas: science, education, cultural, and transatlantic relations, and we like to think of ourselves as a bridge between Portugal and the United States. And we are happy, very much happy today, to receive Elizabeth Economy to talk to us about China in this cycle that we have discussed, that we have started in January 2023, that we call Democracy the Way Ahead. We started in January 2023 because we thought it was important to discuss the challenges to democracy and what we can do as a society to preserve and to defend our democracy. So we wanted to discuss the challenges, but also the way that we can preserve and defend democracy, and we did that from several viewpoints, and it has been a road these almost 2 years. And what better way to continue this process, to bring a new challenge, a real challenge to this our democratic process than a discussion on China. So I'm very pleased to have with us Elizabeth Economy, that will be talking with Raquel Vaz Pinto. Thank you much. Thank you so much for you both, and I hope that we have a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I would definitely like to start this conversation with one of those wow moments in your life. I have followed Elizabeth, Liz, Economy's career for, I think, 2 decades. And as my students can actually confirm, she's always in the core curricula regarding China. Elizabeth Economy has had and still has a very distinguished career. I'll never forget I think was your first book, The River Runs Black, in 2004, in which Elizabeth Economy pointed out the huge issues regarding the environment as a problem, as a big hurdle in terms of China's growth and also the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So, and not many people in the world were actually talking about this, linking the environment, China's growth, and the CCP. So Liz, thank you so much for being here with us. It's really an honor. And let's kick off. We have agreed to divide our conversation in 3 blocks. First of all, the macro, the foreign policy issue, and particularly the relationship with the US. The second one, the relationship, the hurdles, the challenges, mostly between the European Union and China. And lastly, the domestic issues that pertain China and of course, are very important for us to have a correct photograph of this huge and fascinating country, which is China. So, Liz.
Yes. Is that a question or that's a statement? But since you gave me an opening, let me just say thank you, Raquel, for agreeing to do this, and thank you to Rita to both of you for inviting me, and honestly to the absolutely incredible staff of FLAD. Miguel and Nuno and Leonor, who have just been so terrific. I don't think I've ever encountered in all of my travels, quite frankly, a group of people who are, frankly, as organized, who run as smooth an operation, and who are also just so warm and welcoming. So thanks to all of you there in the back, guys. Thank you. Okay, so do you have a question for me? Or
yes, I do.
Okay.
So what does, I'll start with an easy one.
Okay.
What does Xi Jinping want of the world?
Okay. Maybe what does he want of the world for China?
Yes.
Right? What does he want for China? So let's talk about Xi Jinping's foreign policy ambitions, for China, I think, because I think he's the first leader in a very long time to actually have a vision for China's place in the world and for the international system. And over the past 12 years, I would say he's done a fairly impressive job of executing on that vision. I think it is a transformative vision. This is not reform around the margins, as some people say. Some people in the United States like to say Xi Jinping just wants to make the world safe for China or safe for autocracy. But if you make the world safe for autocracy, you make it unsafe for democracy. Thank you, Raquel. Exactly right. So what does he want? I'd say the transformation is taking place across 5 dimensions. First, and I'd say his top priority is really about reclaiming the territory that Xi believes is Chinese sovereign territory. So, of course, Hong Kong has already been fully incorporated now into mainland China. We've seen the end, really, of the one country, two systems. But we have Taiwan. We have the broad area of the South China Sea, the maritime domain. China has territorial conflicts with many countries, Japan and the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. We saw the border conflict with India erupt during COVID. So all told, about 14 different territorial claims that China has. And so it's really about redrawing the very map of China, kind of territorial expansion. And he has said, for example, that Taiwan, sort of reunification with Taiwan, is one of his 14 must-do items for what he calls the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The second priority, I think, is moving the U.S. out as the dominant security power in the Asia-Pacific. He often talks about Asia as for Asians to govern, right? And we've seen a much more robust military presence by China in the region. And I think, gradually, Xi Jinping believes the United States should move back across the Pacific and be an Atlantic power rather than a Pacific power. Third, I think it's about China as a great power, really, at this point, spreading its influence, political, economic, and military, globally. In the first instance, really through the Belt and Road Initiative, which began as a program of infrastructure development globally back in 2013, but has expanded since then to become a digital Silk Road. So it's subsea cables and e-commerce and satellite systems. And there's the Health Silk Road and the Green Silk Road and the Polar Silk Road, all ways for China to connect China to increase China's centrality and connect China through to the rest of the world, not only commercially, but also through the spread of Chinese values. So you can see that in, for example, Tanzania, in Guangxi province, now in Antigua, China has set up training centers where officials from regions, the countries around the region can come to learn about the China model. Right? Back in 2017, Xi Jinping said, China presents an alternative model to that of market democracy. So come and learn from China. And you can learn things like poverty alleviation, how China's tackled that, but you can also learn how to control dissent on the internet, right? How to have a robust, central one-party system. So I think there's the political dimension, and then clearly a military dimension. We saw China's first military logistics base in Djibouti, and there are more, military installation now in Cambodia. The PLA has been there for 5 months. They're saying it's not a permanent presence, but it certainly seems like it might be permanent. And then just to finish quickly, I think taking that sort of China model, spreading it through, things like the Belt and Road, then cementing those norms and values and policy preferences through transformations within the international system, through the United Nations, where China has been very effective. I think for many years, in large part because the United States, Europe, and other leading economies kind of ignored the UN and the importance of the UN, but China never did. Has traditionally placed very significant amount of importance on the United Nations. And so you wake up one day and find out that somehow China has managed to get the Belt and Road Initiative written into 26 different UN agencies and programs as part of their mandate, sometimes even in their charter. Why should the Belt and Road be, a priority for Interpol, for example? It really shouldn't be, but it is. So I think, that effort around transforming norms around human rights, advancing Chinese technical standards, internet governance, these are all priority areas for China. And then last, I think, and more recently, we've seen Xi Jinping articulate a different vision for the global economy, which is largely what he calls dual circulation, which basically says that China is such a big economy that it can innovate, manufacture, and consume largely within itself. It will still export to other countries, and it still wants multinationals to be dependent on China for parts of their supply chain. Xi Jinping has said explicitly that he believes that this is an important source of political leverage for China with other countries. But at the same time, he wants to insulate China from the pressures of the global economy. So it's a kind of unique system that he's attempting to develop. So I think those are the basic tenets, I think, of Xi Jinping's sort of transformative vision. And again, I think, if you look at the progress he's made over the past 12 years, it has not been insignificant.
No, at all. In terms of one of the things that is quite interesting, and you've mentioned this very thoroughly in your books, is how China is expanding its influence, doing what all great powers attempt to do, maximize your national interests, has greater leverage in the United Nations. I mean, the amount of attempts to talk about this or that certain issue are effectively blocked, and I think that's something in which the EU and the US have been quite honestly sleeping on the issue. But at the same time, this vision, these initiatives, this way of looking at the world, but there's not what we would call the classical alliance system. This is to say, the US has allies within NATO. It has allies, specific, concrete alliances with South Korea, with Japan, with Australia, which is, I think, one of those countries that one should look at if we want to understand the changes of the 21st century in terms of strategic thinking and everything they're doing. But China does not have this classical alliance commitment or not.
No, you're quite right. In fact, one of the things that Xi Jinping calls for is the end of the US-led alliance system. He says it's anachronistic, a relic of the Cold War, targeted at China. So he calls for the end of it. Nonetheless, I think while it doesn't have hard and fast alliances, and even has kind of pushed back, when Putin has kind of hinted at the prospect of a formal alliance with China, Xi Jinping has not bitten. Nonetheless, the way that China is engaging with countries like Russia, like Iran, begins to look like a soft alliance.
Okay.
And so the degree to which China is now doing formal military exercises with certain countries, the degree to which their policies and their activities are aligned, for example, in the United Nations, it starts to look a little bit like China has its own form of alliances, nothing hard and fast, except with North Korea, nothing hard and fast. But, obviously look at the kind of support they've been offering to Russia throughout the Ukraine war, right? Not providing them necessarily, at least overtly, with military hardware, but everything just about shy of that. So they want Russia to succeed at this point.
And to take their time with it in order to drain the coherence and the patience from the allies or the coalition of countries that are helping Ukraine in this particular war.
Yeah.
But also when we look at the region and China, you mentioned the territorial disputes. I mean, there are many of them with many countries. If on the one hand, the Belt and Road has been, to a certain extent, we could call it a success, but on the other hand, it has also led countries, for instance, like India, to have a more active foreign policy in order to kind of counteract against what they see when they look at the world, when they see Gwadar in Pakistan, when they see Hambantota in Sri Lanka, the moves in Nepal, the moves in Myanmar, and the sense of encirclement that India has regarding China. So by stating the territorial expansion or the reinforcement of their frontiers, of their borders, isn't China acting to a certain extent, it's counterproductive in the region?
So one of the things we often think in the United States, or I shouldn't say we, because there are a number of Americans in this audience, one of the things I often think, and some other like-minded people often think, is that we were saved during the Trump administration in terms of our foreign policy, because of course we were pulling out of many different international accords and other things. We were saved by Xi Jinping's inability to capitalize on the moment. And not only in terms of the territorial ambitions and aggression, not only in terms of the way that China pursues the Belt and Road with the lack of transparency and the sort of poor labor and governance standards. You could find protests in every Belt and Road country around Chinese projects. The COVID, handling of the COVID, the economic coercion, the wolf warrior diplomacy, all of that. China is often its own worst enemy. And so even as it seems to be making progress, and it does, it is a kind of one step forward and two steps back. But I don't think we should rely on China making its own mistakes in order for the US and Europe to succeed. I think we need to have our own proactive and positive message and effort around the value and the importance of the current, maybe not the current, maybe a reformed liberal international order. So it's just as important that we put out a vision that's attractive to many other countries than that China continues to do what it's doing and, make its own mistakes.
This year is, of course, a very special year for those of us who study international relations. It is, of course, a year of presidential elections in the superpower. And in that regard, I think we're all already very worried, losing our sleep, or thinking about a million scenarios about what can happen at the end of this year. Now, I'm not going to ask you, of course, who do you think is going to win, but there is this idea that within the United States, with different nuances, with different dimensions, or some building blocks more than others, but that there is a kind of a consensus within the United States as to how it perceives China. So, do you think that is true on the one hand? And if so, do you think we can distinguish, for instance, greater concerns on part of the Republicans, and I say Republicans also in plural, because I think that now we have at least two Republican parties within the same party, and the Democrats. Do they emphasize some issues more than others? Do you think that's critical? Because we were discussing earlier, when we look at the Trump administration, which was disruptive, at least in style, and we were comparing Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and in fact, the Indo-Pacific got the better part of the Trump administration rather than Europe. So do you think that there is this kind of, whoever gets elected at the end of the year, there is this consensus within the United States?
I think within the arena of Washington, there is a very high degree of consensus that China is the most consequential long-term strategic challenge or threat to the United States. And that's true whether we're talking politically, economically, or in the security front. So I think that consensus exists. I think it helps to forge a sense of cohesion within Congress that otherwise really does not exist. And to some extent, Congress tries to use that to forge a broader sense of cohesion among the broader American public about this threat. So in some ways, I think it's interesting. The United States is using China to do a lot of things it should be doing anyway. Things like investing more at home through things like the Chips and Science Act, right, and semiconductors, the Inflation Reduction Act, our investments in clean energy, or broadband for all. All of these things we should be doing anyway, but China has become the reason for doing it. That can be helpful, but at the same time it's harmful because it paints a bullseye on China, and that it tends to lead to more inflammatory rhetoric that's not helpful, for example, to Chinese Americans within the country. And so, I would prefer that we were doing these things for the right reasons and not using China as a foil. But that is the nature of the sort of political beast right now, and I anticipate that will continue. Where I think there's more difference of opinion is outside the Beltway. And I think you and I both know, because we swing in the same circles, that there's a fairly wide range of opinion when it comes to China, or how the United States should approach China in the sort of the academic and the think tank world in the United States, ranging from the United States is responsible for a lot of what China does, China's negative actions, because we make China insecure. Right? And therefore, China is basically responding to this sense of insecurity. A little bit of the argument about Russia, Ukraine, right? That idea of indivisible security, that Russia did this because it was feeling insecure about NATO expansionism. So a little bit of that kind of argument. Then there are people, probably like me, who say China is the most consequential threat. We need to be resilient at home. We need to have strong alliances. We need to make sure our economic tools are up to the challenge of defending our economic and national security. At the same time, we should still continue to engage and try to find areas of common interest and purpose with China to the extent that we can, right? Keep the door open, keep channels of communication open. And then there's another group, I would say, that is much more like we don't need to have these dialogues with China. They're a waste of time. There's just talk. There's nothing productive that's going to come out of them. We need to be guarding against everything that China is doing, and that should be our primary focus, right? Not trying to, there is no common ground and common purpose, because China is bent on basically, bringing the United States down. So I think there's a wider array of opinion being expressed outside of Washington, where I think there is a good deal of consensus. Not complete. There still are moderate Democrats and Republicans, people that used to be the center on China policy. There was a China working group headed by people like Rick Larson. They're still there. They think that the direction in which the U.S. has moved is a little bit too far, but their voices are very muted at this point, almost non-existent.
The United States regarding China, as academics, we love buzzwords. We started off with the decoupling, then we went into the de-risking.
We plagiarized from you guys, from Ursula von der Leyen. We appreciate that. Yeah.
And I think that also shows that in certain instances there's greater changes or interchanges regarding, for instance, these key concepts. And in that regard, in your latest book, you go into a lot of areas which are, of course, crucial, and at the same time, they also show how, in fact, the China of 2024 is really different from the China of 2 decades, 3 decades ago. You cannot decouple from China if you don't have rare earths developed within your country. You cannot decouple from China regarding other critical raw materials, and at the same time, there is this extra hurdle from Washington or from a foreign policy point of view, which is your companies. And of course, China developed the factory of the world and everything. So if on the one hand, there is a lot of discussion about these terms, on the other, I think that the starting point from the US and the European Union is, of course, quite different. And it is obviously different because the United States is a country and the European Union is not. So looking at those differences, this idea of de-risking, which was also endorsed by the G7, do you think that it's feasible? Do you think it's an option on the table that allows Europe, the US, to diversify, to mitigate the risks in these key areas?
Oh, absolutely. I think in the United States, and I'd be interested in your opinion on Europe, quite frankly, but in the United States, it's already happening. The level of US investment in China was at its lowest level last year. Trade was down from the year before. As you know, I was at the Commerce Department as the senior advisor to the Secretary of Commerce for 2 years. I finished that in October as a formal advisor. And so had the opportunity to meet with many CEOs who would pass through the department and talk about China, their experience with China, what was going on for their particular industry and what they were doing. And I would say probably let's say 70% of the CEOs who came through were actively looking to de-risk. We had CEOs come and say, can you help us at the Commerce Department figure out a plan? Will you sit down with our people and figure out how we can diversify, right? Because we have a lot of supply chain work going on at the Commerce Department. And I know a company that said where the CEO said, you know, we have 2,500 sort of first-tier products that we source from China, and told his staff, I want replacements for all of them by 2025. So imagine how, you know, intense a process that is to figure out. So I would say there are very few areas that have like technology applications that are not, where the CEOs are not actively looking for diversification. There's so much going on. I think there are multiple pressures, though, that are pushing this. It's not simply about the United States government saying, you need to de-risk, right? So I think the wake-up call around COVID was important for many companies. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was important. A lot of, you know, board members started talking about what's your contingency for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? What's your plan, you know, for that? The export controls, right? The sort of sense for where is the U.S. government going to go? What's the small yard, high fence? What does that actually look like? The fact that actually the yard grows, the fence increases. And the government has been quite frank about that, right? When you're talking about technology and technological innovation, you can't ring fence it at one point in time. You know, as we gain more understanding of what kinds of technologies could be used for military purposes by China that will undermine our national security, those export controls will continue to expand. So that's, you know, part of it too. And then there's what's going on inside China, which sometimes people forget. Businesses don't forget, but sometimes we forget when we're talking about it, because China itself has become such a less welcoming place for so many multinationals, right? Restrictions around the flow of economic information the businesses need to make good decisions. So data security laws, the espionage law, you know, for you and me, you know, if we say negative things about China, outside China, which we both have, we can be arrested in China when we're there. I mean, what kind of chilling effect does that have? The raids that China's undertaken against consultancies, they've now termed consultancies formally spy agencies. So I think with that kind of political climate, the securitization of the economy in China, that also has a chilling effect for many businesses, for many US businesses. So I think, you know, there's a process underway. Having said all of that, right, the China market is still enormously attractive. You know, it's still big, and for many companies still represents, you know, a healthy percentage of their revenues, and they want to be there. And even if they feel the competition from China heating up, you know, take a sector like medical devices, where already at the low end, China's undertaken a number of, Chinese medical devices are competitive, and they've taken a number of steps to basically keep, you know, foreign medical devices out. Internal sort of barriers to entry for foreign companies. Still at the higher end, you know, European companies, American companies still dominate, but many of them will say, we know that's not forever, but we want to be there for as long as we possibly can. So I think there's still enthusiasm in certain sectors and a desire to be there, but for many business people and many boards, there is a lot of concern about the direction in which the China market is moving. Last thing I'll say is when I traveled to China with the secretary back in August, and we met with, you know, everybody from the premier on down. We heard the same thing from all of the senior officials, which was basically, we want American business back. We want multinationals here, right? You know, everyone is all of these officials are having roundtables with CEOs to tell them, we're open for business, come back. And the secretary said, it's not about telling them you're open for business, come back. It's about what you're doing on the ground to make an environment in which they want to come back. You have to change your policies on the ground. And I think thus far we have not seen any real interest or ability on the part of the Chinese government to do that. So that's why I think de-risking is a process that's clearly started in the United States and is likely to continue. but maybe Europe is a step or two behind.
It's trickier. It's trickier because not only do we have to, we have, of course, in commercial terms, a European bloc. There is the impetus of the European Commission, and I think on that regard, von der Leyen has done a terrific job. I think she's been strategically sound and very much so. I mean, if we look, for instance, at the Critical Raw Materials Act, which I think is one of the most consequential documents ever produced by the European Commission, if we look at key sectors in which there is, of course, the issue of unfair competition. It's not the competition, it's the unfair competition. And thirdly, the issue of reciprocity or lack of reciprocity. This is to say, Chinese companies can invest in certain sectors within the European continent, and then the same does not apply the other way around. This is to say, European companies cannot compete in certain sectors within the Chinese economy. So I think that on that level, I think the direction is very clear. And for instance, the fact that last week or on the last 2 weeks, NUCTEC, which is a company that does security screening, the screeners that we all have to face when we travel and everything else. And it's much more than the fact that they have started looking into this company is the fact that the head of the company is the son of Hu Jintao, the former president, the former Secretary General of China. And that is, of course, something that much more than the issue itself is the political issue arising from it. And then there's the national level. And within the national level, this is where things get, of course, trickier. I think that a country that has been through, many big changes, particularly because of the Russian aggression and war regarding the Ukraine, is of course Germany. I think when we think of trade issues, we of course are always thinking about particularly the car industry. And in that regards, it's just baffling to see the CEO of Volkswagen going to Xinjiang and saying that, the factories are nice, everybody is very happy, and the Uyghurs have no problems whatsoever. I think it's just a bit too much, to be honest. But at the same time, there are many dynamics within the EU. And the cultural element, the sectors in which you are strong, and in that sense, it makes a big difference if you're a state like the United States, and if you are not like the EU. And I think that the Commission can only do so much if there are either electoral consequences in this particular Länder within Germany, and this is where the EU gets, I wouldn't say complicated, but it's really heterogeneity. We tend to think of the EU as homogeneous, but it's not. And the national, the regional, the local level comes in. So I think that China is, of course, here, and the relationship with China, a litmus test in that regard and that evolution. But one of the, I think that it's perhaps an area, and I think even the recent declarations of Macron is the perception of how China has positioned itself with Russia regarding the Ukraine that I think is actually quite interesting to see in terms of the perception. So this could be like my really fast answer to you, because it's very complicated. But I would also like to, when we talk about the US and China, and one of the things that in your books is really clear is how you use the data. I mean, we have these good research tools by Pew Research Center, by the Transatlantic Trends, that gives us, in fact, data on how people perceive foreign policy, certain countries. And it is true, and that I think is unquestionable, that there has been a change of perception regarding China in a more negative way in general. within these countries or within the transatlantic countries. The rest of the world is perhaps a different story. But there is, at the same time, a difference of generation. I mean, all the studies show that the older you are, the critical you are. But in the younger generation, they are perhaps less critical of China. And do you think that that has to do, for instance, with the technological edge, with TikTok, with the 5G, with Huawei and everything?
I mean, it could be that. It could just be real exposure to China, real understanding, engagement with the issues that China is presenting to the country. I mean, if you're 18 years old or 19 years old, if your life isn't yet sort of directly affected, aside from maybe your use of TikTok, isn't really being directly affected by the way that your country is engaging with China, maybe it doesn't resonate in the same way. So it may be generational only in the sense that by the time they're 30 years old, right, these same people who are more positively inclined become less positively inclined.
Okay.
I think it's hard to know. Maybe country by country, it could be different. I mean, I will say when it comes to TikTok, I have 3 grown children, 27, 25, and 23. My oldest says, "I'm not on TikTok. I don't want the Chinese government tracking what I'm doing." My middle son is not on any social networking things, and my daughter said she loves TikTok, and she said, "I don't care if the Chinese government knows what I'm doing. I don't do anything that they're going to be interested in." And so I think, even in that spread of ages, very different opinions about China and, the technology and what that kind of engagement, could mean for them. So I think, there are wide opinions in the United States, and we'll see how this plays out. Of course, this is right now coming to a head in the United States, and TikTok has now, put itself in the position of putting forth a lawsuit, and that the U.S. ban on TikTok is unconstitutional.
Sure.
So we'll see. We'll see how it all comes out. I think, legal scholars in the U.S. are not convinced that TikTok couldn't win. So it'll be very interesting to see.
Yes, and I think that we'll also be watching and seeing how it plays out, because that's perhaps the next step within Europe or not, depending on how it goes. When we also look at China, and you've already touched upon this, we don't tend to see, but of course the Chinese government also makes it more difficult for us to see the issues or to see the challenges within China. We don't pay enough attention to what's going on in China, not just because it's the second biggest economy in the world, not just because it has all sorts of dimensions of hard power, but we generally have, I think, a kind of a mental map that doesn't really include what's going on within China. And which key areas, sector, themes do you think we should be paying attention to when it comes to the internal politics of China?
So I think that's a really important question, because back in 2010, 2011, we had much greater visibility into the internal dynamics within China, into the social challenges, 180,000 protests in China in 2010 that were being documented by a Chinese professor at Tsinghua University. There were 7,000 international non-governmental organizations that were working inside China on issues like the environment and poverty alleviation and migrant education. So there was so much, businesses obviously were deeply engaged in China. There was so much back and forth, so much civil society engagement that you really could get a sense for all the elements of social change and dynamism. And that has really come to a screeching halt, right? Now we've got under 400 international organizations, non-governmental organizations that are working in China. There's very little civil society direct contact, aside from Chinese students coming out. And businesses we've talked about is a little bit in a pullback mode. So, and obviously the information flow from China is much less, right? Many of our journalists have been kicked out. They've moved to Taiwan. They've gone to Singapore now. They're, everywhere but inside China. So I think it's hard. I would say in addition to the economic issues that are kind of front and center in most media reporting today, like the challenge of the property sector, the challenge of local government debt, the challenge of the failure for the government to support, the consumer demand. I think for me, what's most interesting and what I want to work on for the next few years in terms of my next big project is the issue of polarization in China and social polarization. Because I would argue that China is easily as polarized as the United States, which I think is not something that most people would intuitively think about China. But if you look across income, China is as unequal a society as the United States is. It certainly on issues of nationality and ethnicity. Look at how China treats the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, Inner Mongolians, right? If you look at such a divide there, as opposed to the Han Chinese, which are the vast majority of Chinese. If you look at gender issues, which we were talking about earlier, one of the really interesting things, the World Economic Forum does an annual review of women's access to the health system, the political system, the economy, and the educational system, and for all countries. And China, under Xi Jinping, beginning in 2012 and up until 2022, I think was the last year that I've looked at, maybe 2023, fell from 69th to 113th. It may be at 107th now again. Nonetheless, I mean, it's incredible. As this economy has grown, as this country has become this major power over the past 12 years, the role of women has become so much smaller. And we see that politically as well.
Yes.
No women in
Yes.
the Politburo at all. No women among the top, 25 or so leaders in the country. 4% of the Central Committee, the next almost 200 leaders. About a quarter, slightly more than a quarter of all the representatives to the National People's Congress. It's astonishing, actually. And then, many, many reports and good books like the one by Leda Hong-Fincher talking about sort of the crackdown on the feminist movement in China. And it's not just the feminist movement, it's LGBTQ, it's sort of all people who are protesting for greater rights for certain groups. So I think that's, to me, is a really fascinating issue. And then I think there's a big division between what I would call the bureaucratic class and the creative class in China. So people that are in the Chinese government and then people whose job it is to think creatively. Could be professors, could be entrepreneurs, people who want to color outside the lines, or who need to be successful in some respects. Their world has become so much smaller over the past 12 years, right? The range of ideas with which scholars can engage, certainly in the political and in political science or history, has shrunk incredibly. And the same with entrepreneurs. And we've seen what's happened where the heads of many of China's major internet and IT companies have resigned, retired, taken a step back because they've come under so much political pressure. So I just think that there's a really significant story to be told, and I think it's reflected in that lack of consumer demand, in that lack of consumer confidence, in that enormously, problematic birth rate that China now faces, right? Because birth rate tracks with consumer confidence, actually. And you've seen that birth rate, despite China having moved away from the one-child policy, now you can basically have as many children as you want. They're not having children. And so a huge demographic problem for the future in China, and really no way to recover at this point in time. But women know they'll be penalized in the workplace.
Yes.
It's expensive. They don't have the social welfare net that will support them having more children. And so, China's creating many problems. The repressive apparatus that has developed is creating many problems, I think, that are going to continue to have a big impact, not only on the fabric of Chinese society, not only on the legitimacy of the government, but also, frankly, on economic growth in the future, because you're essentially marginalizing pretty significant parts of your population.
Just to, if you're interested in this person that we were talking about, Leta Hong Fincher, she has this really great book. It's called Betraying Big Brother, and she explains how, in terms of gender equality, the women in China have had for quite some time a really tough job, and with Xi Jinping, that's actually one of the traits that accompanies this idea of greater repression. And everything that Liz has just mentioned, these are just like highlights in the sense that you get this half of the population that will be increasingly under pressure to marry, to have children, to stay at home, to not work, at the same time that some of them, due to the one-child policy, have in their shoulders the responsibility to care, to raise, to protect their elder families, so particularly their grandparents and parents. So it's a kind of, it's not something immediate, it's not an immediate explosion, but it's a kind of frustration after frustration after frustration, because this is really like it's half of the population. It's amazing in terms of and the sign of Xi Jinping taking out the only woman that there was in the Politburo is also quite interesting in terms of his idea of what the role of the family, or his idea of the role of women in Chinese society.
Yeah, I mean, he's a very patriarchal figure and very traditional kind of male figure. You know, he has complained about having, in his band, in fact, right, effeminate Chinese men, right, appearing in movies and this kind of thing. He's very micromanaging, right, in the sort of cultural ethos of the country. And one of the incredible things for me was when, I think it was 2 years ago now, within the National People's Congress, there was a proposal, going back to the gender issue, a proposal to levy a tax against couples that didn't have children.
Yes.
I mean, this, you know, and even a proposal, this was a great one too, a proposal to support college students having babies, getting married and having babies, that the government would provide financial support for this. I mean, that's how crazy things have become, especially when you consider that, you know, 2 decades or so ago, they were having programs of forced sterilization and forced abortion. I mean, it's really unbelievable.
And this, just to finish up this point, it was the South China Morning Post, so in that sense, you know, particularly reliable regarding the regime's intentions. And there was this news story that now, I mean, you get married, and after, I don't remember the exact number of months, but I think it was 3 or 4 months after, you get a call from the Chinese Communist Party asking why, so, you know, everything is going okay, so no babies yet. So, and this is like the level of invasion of your privacy and of the big choices that you make in life. So I think that I'm so looking forward for your next book. I think it's spot on as always. And I think that just to to finish our wonderful conversation, I would like to ask you, taking into account this enormous stress on accessing information, on being able to travel to China without serious even security implications, as some hostages can actually provide for that. What would be your advice to students who want to study China and who want to, you know, to develop their academic interests on China? What would be your advice to them?
I mean, I think it's incredibly important that more and more students study China and study Chinese and go to China. I think, you know, basically, students at the level of, you know, high school and college should be relatively safe, right? As long as you don't do things that overtly, you know, are against the law, you should be safe. And China really wants foreign students to come. In fact, even some of the hyper-nationalists who have been critical of foreigners, and especially foreigners who speak out against, have been saying, for example, recently Wang Wen, who's a former editor of the Global Times, which is a very vitriolic nationalist newspaper, said, we need to change, meaning we, China, need to change our sort of cultural policies and our political atmosphere to get more Europeans and Americans back studying and working in China, because right now all we have are people from developing economies. And so there's a desire to have people come back and study, so I think it's a relative safe space, and we have to have that next generation be prepared to engage, to be the next scholars, to be the policymakers, to be informed with real depth about this country. Having said that, I think for graduate students, particularly, let's say, in political science and history, it is much more complicated now. So almost no graduate students that I know in the United States at this point are undertaking dissertations, PhD dissertations that will require field work in China. Which was always, especially for comparativists, kind of the gold standard, right? You might go spend a year or 2 years even in a village, living with the villagers and studying, various policies and, how they implement policies from the center, whatever it might be. Or, you might be like me and spend, 6 months in China, 6 months in Russia looking at their climate change policies. Whatever it is, you want to have that on-the-ground experience. Instead, what we find is that they're doing research using data sets, right, statistical analyses. And I think this is a real shame. But the truth of it is, it's very, very difficult to get permission to do the kind of field work that we used to do in China today. The Chinese government is not interested in having graduate students roaming around the country. They've closed a lot of their archives to foreign scholars, so historians find it very difficult to get access to the information. So that's a real challenge at this point, and it's unfortunate. And I don't know how and when that situation changes, but I think at least at the undergraduate level and for language training and basic, go get a master's degree there if you've really got the fluency in the language, I think it's really great and important to do it.
Okay, good. Now, let's go for some questions. And following the precedent established by Pedro Magalhães, which I think is a really good precedent, he's usually very good in everything. So we start. The first question has to come from the younger part of our audience. First row.
Can they identify themselves too? So
Yeah, can you please just identify yourself? Yeah. The micro, sir.
I'm a Kazel student. I'm an 11th grade Kazel student. My name is Tyrone. So part of Taiwan's defense against Chinese aggression has been sort of the silicon shield, as we see in Taiwan semiconductor industries. And TSMC, the head, has openly threatened to make their facilities unusable if China was to attack. And do you think that Xi Jinping is willing to run the risk of the destruction of this essential piece of the global economy to reunify Taiwan?
It's a great question.
Great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the things that people misjudged about Xi Jinping when it came to Hong Kong was that Hong Kong was the financial center, right? It was a kind of a shining beacon of leadership for mainland China in the financial center, and people thought he will never kill the golden goose. Right? He killed it. He went in and he killed it. No two ways about it. I think what's happening now is that China is in an enormous race to develop its indigenous capabilities with semiconductors. And so do I think at this very moment TSMC is part of a deterrent that Taiwan possesses? Yes. Do I think that China is actively driving to a point where they're not that? Yes. And actually the percentage of semiconductors that TSMC, as a total percentage of semiconductors that TSMC sells, the percentage going to China has gone down. And so I think China's in a race to make TSMC irrelevant to its calculations. But I think for now, it is one of several factors that would cause Xi Jinping to hesitate. Having said all that, I don't think Xi Jinping right now is interested in military action against Taiwan. I don't think he's confident about the capabilities of his military to be successful. I don't think he's interested in the disruption to his own economy, putting even aside TSMC, and he's unsure what the international reaction would be. So I think we're not looking at an imminent military action, but I think he's moving to the point where he has that capability.
And if you have an interest in this semiconductors, perhaps I think the book to read is Chris Miller, The Ship War. It's a really wonderful book, easy to understand and read. Those of us who are not very, technological, friendly kind of people, and so that would be, I think, a good starting point. It gives you a really good picture of what's going on in South Korea, in Japan, in the US, and of course Taiwan. Thank you very much for your question. Okay. Yes, I'll go for the...
Okay, first, thank you very much, Dr. Economy, for giving us a wonderful night and
sharing. Can you please introduce yourself?
Oh, yes, please. And you can call me Tony. I'm a student here. I'm a student at University of Lisbon, studying law. I'm from, I prefer not to say, but I guess you have an answer where I'm from. Yeah. So my question is that I have heard a voice from Europe that it says there are concerns in Europe about the consistency and continuity of U.S.-China policy and U.S. foreign policy in general. So it basically says that Europe should not align its China policy too closely with U.S. in case someday the U.S. may make a significant adjustment about its China policy, especially consider a possible Trump return. So that says the Europe should always have Plan B or reserve some room for the future adjustment. So I'd like to know what's your opinion about this this saying? Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
I mean. Absolutely, Europe has its own foreign policy, its own China policy. Not only does the EU have its own China policy, but countries within, like Germany, has its own China strategy that it has put out. What I will say about Germany's China strategy, its major companies notwithstanding, is that if you read it and you compare it to the US China strategy, even a lot of the language is the same. I think that there are, always, and I think Raquel, sort of elucidated some of these earlier differences, going to be some differences in nuance between the European Union, the United States, Japan, Australia. Every country has its own economic interests. It's the priority that it places on the economy or national security or, human rights and political issues with regard to a China policy. But I think what we've seen, and frankly largely due to China's own actions, is that the policies of the EU, of the United States, of Australia, of South Korea, of Japan, of Canada, have become more and more closely aligned. I think there's, information sharing among them, certainly. Different countries experience different elements of China policy at different times and in different ways. For example, when you think about something like Chinese influence operations, really it was Australia that was the canary in the coal mine that kind of said, oh my gosh, right, look what China's trying to do within our political system to try to, shape the way our, who's elected in our country, right? Or to become involved in the media, whatever. Then, the United States got very agitated about this. And I would say Europe followed, right? Certain countries in Europe were way ahead of others. The Czech Republic, Lithuania were very up in arms about influence operations. Other countries a little slower off the mark. So I think the issues that all these, the European Union, the United States, and major countries in Asia, that they believe they are confronting when it comes to China across all of those things, military, economics, and political issues, are largely the same. I think they just come to the realization at different times and may have some nuances in their policy. But for sure, the United States does not dictate policy to the EU. We may try forcefully to tell the EU what we would like them to do. And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. And we also learn from the EU. I mean, the de-risking strategy or idea or term really came from the EU to the United States. And we were very happy to have that term because it very perfectly captured what we were trying to accomplish. So do I think Europe needs its own China policy? Absolutely. I think it has its own China policy. It will decide how closely it wants to align with the United States. And I think right now it's decided, for the most part, we're pretty closely aligned.
Yeah. I think they're in the back.
Hi, I'm Laura. I studied here in Lisbon, but I'm now working in the Brussels bubble. You mentioned that one of China's priorities is to regain regional hegemony, like meaning being superior to the US in the Pacific. But do you see this capability development, and especially capability development in the maritime domain, as a larger plan of like global hegemony, like competing with the US on a global scale, or is it more regional and focus on regaining hegemony at the regional level only?
Thank you.
Yeah, another really good question. I think that there are different, I think hegemony is largely confined to the Indo-Pacific. I don't think China sees itself as the hegemon of the world, in large part because I think China has ambitions to have the rights of being a superpower, but not necessarily all the responsibilities of it. But I think within its own domain, I think it would like the US largely out. I think, you know, the entire issue of the South China Sea, for example, and United States, you know, activity there, freedom of navigation, the US support for the Philippines, all of these things are very, very bothersome to China. US support for Taiwan. It doesn't want the US meddling in what it considers to be its backyard. Right? The US has Latin America. China thinks China has the Indo-Pacific. I think on the global stage, it is looking for support for its policies, its values, its norms, you know, in a certain range of areas, a certain range of issues. You know, again, on human rights, on internet governance, it wants its technical standards adopted in the UN standard-setting bodies. It's pushing now for the de-dollarization of the global economy. So it has lots of ideas. In some respects, you know, it's both about China basically emerging as a greater power and having greater influence and diminishing, consequently diminishing US power and influence. But again, I don't think it sees itself as a hegemon, a global hegemon with all the same responsibilities for global security that the United States has held for, you know, for decades.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation and for coming here. So I'm going to start by basically prefacing my question and then explaining what I mean with that, and then I'll go to it. So basically, how many hits can the Western model take to its image? Because the process that leads to norms cascading and being internalized requires like a clear definition of what a norm is, what constitutes a violation of said norm, and with the US's, like, let's say, mishandling of the situation in Palestine, senators like threatening the ICC over a possibility of an arrest warrant for Netanyahu, and the likelihood that even if found guilty by the ICJ, Israel will not face any consequences. Trust on our current international institutions might be tested. So can China profit from this situation? Like looking at what they've done with the mediation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, is there a possibility that China starts influencing norms and models in the near future, like between following already what we're talking about now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo.
Yes, I think there is, every possibility that when the United States falls short, that China now is ready to step into the breach. I think it's interesting if you look back 5 years ago or more now. What am I saying? 5, 7? I don't know. When was that? 2016. 8 years ago, when Donald Trump first came to power, early 2017. And again, he started, withdrawing the United States from a range of international institutions and basically saying, maybe threatening to withdraw from NATO and saying the United States, doesn't want to be responsible for the world. We're not interested in that leadership role. Rejecting really, 100 years of U.S. efforts. I think that was a big opportunity for China. And if you look back at media across the world at that time, you will find many, many, many articles that said China is now going to assume the mantle. Mm-hmm. But it did not assume the mantle. It wasn't ready to assume the mantle. And then we had COVID and everything that induced, and we saw the wolf warrior diplomacy, all of this sort of thing. It was clear China wasn't ready. Instead, you saw various European countries stepping up to do some good things, and Japan really stepping into the breach to lead on, so other countries filled that role. I think China now is better positioned intellectually, in some respects, to try to step into the breach. I think Xi Jinping has articulated through not just the Belt and Road now, but also his, initiatives around, global civilization initiative, development initiative, security initiative, right? Kind of confused, lots of verbiage, but a different model for how the international system would be arranged. Again, the question is, beyond coming in at the 13th hour and forging that Iran-Saudi deal, let's face it, that was not the result of 10 years of Chinese diplomatic maneuverings and negotiation and blood, sweat, and tears. What is China prepared to do? We haven't seen China use its influence in a positive way on Iran, right? Now, which we would consider to be what a responsible leading power might do. So I think, while I agree that there is that opportunity, and Xi Jinping has this vision, the proof is in the pudding. And so let's, to use an American phrase, let's wait and see what happens as time moves on. Because, China put forth a, 10, 12-point plan for Ukraine, which was a big nothing burger. 12, yeah. 12, thank you. Big nothing burger.
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know that they are actually prepared. Again, I think they've put out an intellectual framework for it, but really are they prepared to bear the burden, the responsibility, the risk that the United States has borne? And the failure, right? The failures the United States has definitely experienced. I'm not convinced yet.
And even regarding the Ukraine, the paper on the Ukraine, it never says war, it says crisis.
Yeah.
So if that is a crisis, phew.
There's so many ways in which what China's done on Ukraine is shameful.
Yeah.
Yes,
now for you.
Thank you, Raquel. Patrick Ziegler-Later, president of the American Club. Rita Faden and Flad have chosen to invite this wonderful speaker in the context of a program called Democracy, The Way Ahead.
No.
In 2001, the Western world thought that letting China into the WTO and allowing China to become integrated into the international economy would lead to somewhat of an increase in Chinese democracy. Clearly, that was a mistaken assumption. But you talked to us about some of the vulnerabilities domestically in China. You who have this capacity to see long term, at a time when today, we think of democracy as being fragile. I'm not terribly worried about, I'm concerned with the fragility, but not terribly worried about the long-term survival capacity of democracy. In 2050, do you think democracy will have a somewhat tiny, larger role in the way China functions?
Okay, so the way I really want to answer that is by saying, I think actually engagement, which is the policy you were talking about, that the United States pursued with regard to China, and I think Europe largely
as well.
also supported, did not fail, right? It failed to achieve everything that we wanted it to achieve. But again, if you look back to that period of 2010 and 2011 in China, you had a situation where the internet was this incredibly vibrant political space. You had individuals running for local elections as independents, not party members, who were being supported by the National Endowment for Democracy and George Soros. You know, you had billionaires who had followers of 20 and 30 million people calling for improvements to the environment or broader political reform. You had a leading internet, I will say, entrepreneur from Taiwan, who will remain nameless, you know, taking a boatload of billionaires to Taiwan to explore what could democracy in China actually look like. And you had a combination of those entrepreneurs and scholars, political scientists, and lawyers meeting on a monthly basis in people's homes in China, in Beijing and Shanghai, to talk about how do we push for a democratic transition. So I think, and as I mentioned, you had 180,000 protests, right? So you had a very engaged civil society population. And I will say, even today, there's been this great survey research done by Jennifer Pan at Stanford, who's done survey research for urban middle class in China that finds the majority want greater freedom of speech, the right to assemble and to protest, the right to hold their leaders accountable, greater property rights. They also are fairly nationalistic. Nonetheless, they have all of those attributes still in their head for what they want. So I think, honestly, had you not had Xi Jinping come to power, I think you may have had a very different China even today. It still might not have been a China that was adhering to all of the rules of the WTO, because you know what? It served China's economy well to basically steal IP, you know, do everything else they were doing, you know, export, you know, the bejesus out of things and whatever else. I mean, so I think that still may have been a problem. But I think had you had leaders like Li Keqiang or Li Yuanchao, some others who were more reform-oriented, you may have had a different kind of China. So I would say nothing is impossible. I was a student of the Soviet Union before I started studying China, and studied Gorbachev very closely, and who would have predicted him, right? So who can predict what might happen in you know, an authoritarian system that is so opaque? I would say you never can say never in terms of what might happen. I think what's important to recognize is that the desire for political change in China exists today. And just because we can't see it in the same way that we used to, we should not forget ever that it's still there.
The same way that we usually forget that the Republic of China was founded by Sun Yat-sen, who was practicing Christian. And that's something that usually just goes, you know, outside the, well, Chiang Kai-shek as a Christian, I have my doubts, but Sun Yat-sen for sure. So I think that's two last questions, please, and then we have to close, right? Boss? Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Rui Boavida. I was a journalist and a correspondent from Beijing, based in Beijing, in the good old 3 days before the Olympics, before running to the Olympics. I have one question for you, which is, do you know where Xinjiang is? No, okay, I'm kidding. But my real question is back in the mid-2000s, people were assuming that the need for energy supplies and energy resources will be both a constraint on China's growth and the main driver of China's foreign affairs, in that way, of foreign policy. do you believe that energy is still playing that part? Will be still a constraint? It's still an important driver on China's policy on the globe? Thank you.
I mean, I guess I don't I don't remember personally thinking that it would be like the main driver of Chinese foreign policy or a constraint on growth. It was doing a lot back then to diversify its sources of supply. It was, looking into fracking. It had lots of things going on. But I think it certainly plays a role. It's certainly important. And you can see right now, the increase, for example, in the energy that it's getting from Russia. I mean, it is tied into its foreign policy, certainly. China's attention to the Middle East, I think, was initially at least driven by that. I think its attention has expanded much beyond energy now. So I think energy plays a role, but I don't see it as driving its foreign policy decisions. I don't think, for example, China's support for Russia has very much to do with its desire for access to Russian oil and gas. I think that those things stand apart. It's an added benefit, but I don't think it's a fundamental driver.
So last question, please.
Hi. Well, to start, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conference. Just a shame we don't have 10 hours to keep discussing and hearing from you. So it's a privilege. Too bad. Thank you. My name is Felipe. I work on cyber diplomacy. And cyber is one of the key areas where we see a very clear and consistent and comprehensive alignment between China and Russia. Question. To what extent do you believe that their joint partnership, their strategy is indeed aligned? So scratching under the surface and all of the pretty words, their relationship, how resilient is it? And especially the relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. So we end with a very easy question, as you see.
So let me say, I think maybe 3 points. I think first, important to recognize that the China-Russia relationship predates Xi Jinping and Putin. So you can look back in the United Nations and find out that the two countries often supported each other in votes around human rights, around sovereignty issues, in the UN Security Council, et cetera. So there was always a degree, not always, but there has been for a long time, a degree of unity of purpose there. The fear of color revolution, the agreement that what happened to the Soviet Union in terms of the breakup of the Soviet Union is something that the two leaders both jointly, fear and condemn and guard against. I think that's another source of alliance. I think there is a personal friendship. Xi Jinping has said on at least 2 occasions, quite publicly, that Vladimir Putin is his closest friend in the international system. And so I think that there is a relationship there that cannot be denied. He doesn't tend to make those kinds of statements, plus Donald Trump said, Xi Jinping was his best friend, and Xi Jinping did not reciprocate. So, I just point that out to say. So I think that there is a personal element there that is also important. The two economies are complementary. There's an anti-U.S. element to this, of course, and the militaries. Russia traditionally has provided China with a lot of military hardware. Russia's been willing to subsume its Eurasian Economic Union, sort of within the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. I think critically, despite the fact that Russia is generally perceived not only globally, but within Russia itself, I was there in 2018, and I was shocked by this, frankly, by the number of scholars that I engaged with that were comfortable with this idea that Russia was largely a junior partner to China. Because I thought, given Russian nationalism and the sort of traditional Russian pride, especially with regard to China, that there would be a lot of opposition to this notion. But at least at this conference, there was not that notion. But I think that Xi Jinping has been very, very careful here. And he has always, when he speaks about Russia, he puts Russia on par with China. He never talks about Russia in a way that would give the Russians the impression that they were somehow second to China. So if you look, for example, at Wang Yi, the foreign minister and state counselor for foreign affairs, if you look at his speech at the Munich Security Conference, right? Yeah. He talks about the United States and China as sort of the two great powers, but his very next statement is China and Russia as having a new model of like great power relations, like that can be for the world or something like that, right? So again, putting, Russia on par with China. Then he goes on to say, like, China and Europe are two great civilizations, and I think markets, trading powers, or something like that. Everybody gets to be special. That's one of China's strengths.
Yes.
So anyway, to answer your question, I think the relationship is pretty robust at this point, and I think it's personal. I think complementary, again, economically and value-wise, aligned in many respects. I will say, if you look at Chinese scholars' writings on Xi Jinping's decision to support Russia, there is a lot of dissent. Mm-hmm. So within China, there are elements of unhappiness with the fact that Xi Jinping decided not to align with the West and to align with Russia. Yeah.
And on that very optimistic note, we end this really wonderful session. Liz, it was a huge pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank
Raquel.
you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. You did a great job. Thank you.
Yeah, you were perfect.
No, you were a great moderator. Oops, I just said that publicly. You were a great moderator.